I'm going to tell you a story about one of my very favorite ancestors, Matilda Robinson King. I still remember as a little girl hearing this story first from my mother and then reading about it in our genealogy books. Matilda Robinson King was born in 1811 in New York City. She married Thomas Rice King, and they joined the church in 1840. They made their way across the plains and settled with their 7 kids in Fillmore, Utah. There was a time in their life where they spent time in Cove Fort, Utah, which some of you may have been to, and they lived there with 5 to 10 other families. And the story I'm going to tell you takes place in about the year 1867, when Indians ran rampant through that area. This particular day, the men went to work in the fields, as they always did, in the hot summer sun. And because there hadn't been many attacks or sights of Indians recently, somebody left the door unbolted to Cove Fort. Shortly after the men left to work, a tribe of Indians made their way into Cove Fort. Now, the women and children, frightened as they would be seeing these red men come into their home, they ran into my great ancestor's room, Matilda Robinson King. They took their women and children in there and shut the door. You could feel the fright in the room, I'm sure, when these women were waiting to see what the Indians would do. The Indians saw them enter that room and they followed them there. They slammed their fists on the door and entered, and the women sat there in terror. My ancestor, Matilda, had been churning butter at the time, and the smell of butter filled the entire room. She stopped churning her butter when the women came in, and when the Indians followed the women and children, she clenched her apron underneath the table, and it steadied her so that she was not filled with fear. She was brave, and the Indians came in and demanded food. They said, "Food." And Matilda stood up, no fear, and made them food. And of course, they were preparing food all the day, preparing for their nightly meal for when their men returned from the fields. And she got the bread out of the stove and put it in front of the Indians. As the Indians chewed on the bread, the crunchy noise that came from it also steadied Matilda. And one tall man with war paint on his face pointed to Matilda and said, "You sing now." Matilda didn't know what to do, so instead of being fearful, she swallowed and began to sing the first song that came to her head. And she sang the first verse, and all the Indians had looked up in great attention from their food and listened to the first verse of that song. She continued to sing, her delicate melodic voice not wavering through the entire song because of her courage. The Indians listened to every note of that song, and the women too, that were scared of the situation, also were captivated by Matilda's voice. She stopped after the 4th verse of the song, completed the entire song, and looked to the chief Indian that had said, "You sing now." The chief Indian stood from the table and walked out the door, and the other Indians followed. And after they had left, the women came to Matilda and said, How did you know? Where did you learn the Indian language? And Matilda said, I don't know the Indian language. And the women were astonished, and they said, You sang the entire 4 verses of that song in Indian. And it was a song about Indians, and it went straight to the Indians' heart. And they left the frightened white people, went back to their camps, and pondered the words of the song. The last verse says, And all your captive brothers from every clime shall come, and quit their savage customs to live with God at home. Then joy will fill your bosoms, and blessings crown your days, to live in pure religion and sing our Maker's praise. And I felt proud to be an ancestor of this courageous woman that must have had the faith to sing this beautiful song, and she was definitely not alone that day.